We are. It's week 6 of the fantasy season. You know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 6 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have 2 teams on bye week here in week 6 of the season. The Houston Texans, so no CJ Stroud or Dalton Schultz, and the Minnesota Vikings, so no Carson Wentz, JJ McCarthy, or TJ Hawkinson. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Eagles traveling to face the Giants. You got to feel pretty good here if you own Jalen Hurts or Dallas Goedert. You look at this matchup against the Giants, they've been decent against the tight end position this year. They've been not so great against the quarterback position. And overall, while Jalen Hurts hasn't, necessarily played with a ton of upside, he's still the quarterback 5 overall in fantasy. Very safe floor. You got to roll with Jalen Hurts if you own him. And Dallas Goedert has been very productive over the course of this season. He missed week 2, but outside of that, he's had 10 or more fantasy points in every single game. Over the last 3 games, he's had 4 touchdowns. So the volume hasn't been immensely high. He's had 4 or less receptions in the last 3 games, but you still got to feel good here, even on a short week. I think Dallas Goedert just belongs in the start category more than like a streaming option. I've been saying that for a few weeks now. And then moving to the Giants side of things, I have Jackson Dart, who is technically going into this matchup as questionable, but he went into last week as questionable, still played, so I think he's going to be okay. But I have him as a streaming option. I'm a little bit worried. I think he's a lower end streaming option because it's a short week. These Thursday Night Football matchups can get a little weird, can get a little defensive at times. I don't love the matchup necessarily against the Eagles, and this is a tough stretch coming up for the Giants. Eagles, Broncos, Eagles, Niners, but still, I think if you're in a position where you have to stream Jackson Dart, that's okay. I don't think he's the worst option this week, but I also don't think he's the best. Then I think Theo Johnson is streamable, but once again, a lower end stream. I've liked what we've seen over the last 2 weeks with 10 or more fantasy points, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. But this is an Eagles defense that only allows the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so not particularly a great spot. Then we saw some involvement out of Daniel Bellinger for the Giants at tight end last week, but it was still primarily Theo Johnson. So Theo Johnson, a desperation start. We talked about him in the waiver video. If you guys are really hurting at tight end, but I don't particularly love the matchup here in week 6 of the season. All right, Sunday morning, early morning, we're going to have the Broncos and the Jets facing off overseas in London. Another international game here early in the season. Let's start with the Broncos side of things. I'm keeping Bo Nix in the start category. Still at 17.8 fantasy points this past week. We have looked at some lower ceiling games and closer to floors for Bo Nix, but he's still been solid overall. He's a top 12 fantasy quarterback, and I think this is a good enough spot against a Jets defense that really doesn't scare me. This is a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. So once again, these international games, they can get a little weird. Sometimes we see more defense, sometimes we see more offense, sometimes things just go out the window. So I'll still keep Bo Nix as a start. Maybe not my favorite start this week, but I still think he's perfectly solid. Evan Ingram I have in the streaming category. He had 6 targets in week 5, 7 targets in week 4, but most importantly, he did find the end zone against the Eagles this past week, scored a touchdown, had 13 fantasy points, and we have seen over the past 2 weeks a lot, or basically 0 involvement out of Adam Trotman, who at points in the season was maybe looking like he might get a little bit of involvement in this offense, but right now it's mainly just Evan Ingram, so he sits around 45% rostered. I don't want to feed too much off of last week's score, but this is a player at the tight end position that you can stream this week and feel okay about. Then moving to the Jets side of things, I got to keep Justin Fields in the start category. It's really hard for me to push him any lower. This is a tough matchup. The Broncos allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position on the season, but you look at Justin Fields and what he's been able to do on the year outside of that week 2 debacle and missing week 3, he's had 25 or more fantasy points in every start, and he hasn't thrown for over 283 yards in a single game. He's only thrown for more than 1 touchdown in 1 game this year, last week against the Cowboys. Still getting it done on the ground, so Once again, I don't love the matchup here, but I have a tough time calling Justin Fields anything other than a start so far on the year. And then we moved to Mason Taylor. Is very close to putting him in the start category. He's been very solid over the last 2 weeks. Essentially the secondary wide receiver on this team. And, he got more targets last week than Garrett Wilson, which is definitely encouraging. 11.5 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. But once again, I just don't love this matchup against the Broncos. Never know what you're going to get in these London games, but the Broncos top 8 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. So I think he's very startable, a solid stream, but I can't quite put him in the start category here in week 6. All right, moving along into the early window on Sunday, we will have the Seahawks traveling to face the Jaguars. Let's start with Sam Darnold and company. We look to Sam Darnold, what he was able to do last week against the Bucs in a complete shootout, and Sam Darnold lit it up. 28 of 34 against the Bucs, 341 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 1 interception, 28 fantasy points. Very, very solid day, but I don't quite know that we're going to get that same style of matchup here in week 6 on the road against the Jaguars. In the previous 3 games, 16 or more fantasy points for Sam Darnold. So he remains in the streaming category for sure. But this Jacksonville Jaguars defense, nothing to sneeze at. They have been very solid this year. They've been very opportunistic. As you guys saw on Monday Night Football, they did give up more points than they had been against the Chiefs, but they also had a pick 6 all the way from the 1 yard line. So it's a good defense. There is the potential here for Sam Darnold to have a lower ceiling. And the Seahawks defense, in the same respect, not necessarily anything to completely sneeze at. So this could be one of those weird matchups that's a little bit lower scoring. But Darnold remains in the streaming category if you have nothing better. Then A.J. Barner's really been the primary tight end for the Seahawks, and he's only sitting at 3% rostered. He's the tight end 5.5 PPR, the tight end 11 in full PPR. So maybe a name worth paying attention to here. And ultimately, he's had 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 matchups. He's had 3 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, 4 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. So a player worth paying attention to. 24.3 fantasy points once again in that shootout against the Bucs. If you guys are really desperate at tight end, this is a player that you can probably more than likely definitely get off the waiver wire and roll with this week if you have nothing better. But then again, you should probably be able to find options that have been a little bit more consistent. I just don't know. It's not A.J. Barner necessarily that has been consistent. Still the Seahawks offense to a degree that hasn't been completely consistent. But A.J. Barner definitely worth paying attention to. And once again, if you're hurting at tight end, maybe worth just picking up in general. All right, T-Law I have in the streaming category, but I really struggled with this one. I initially still had him as a sit going into the video. I bumped him out to the streaming category because I think it's fair if Sam Darnold's a streamer that T-Law is a streamer, because Trevor Lawrence coming off of his best fantasy performance against the Chiefs on Monday Night Football, 27 fantasy points, 18 to 25, 221 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, 54 yards on the ground, and 2 rushing touchdowns. Had a lost fumble as well, but still, yeah, I mean, if you got to roll with T-Law, you just never know what to expect. He had 8 fantasy points in week 3, 11 in week 4 before playing well on Monday Night Football. And once again, this Seattle Seahawks defense, I don't want to sneeze at them completely, but they're still kind of middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks. So he's a solid enough stream, but I can't call him anything more than that because we have seen some really, really poor fantasy performances out of him on the season. All right, Brenton Strange suffered a hip injury against Kansas City in week 5, so not sure if he's going to be able to go this week. That would presumably put Johnny Munt in the mix, who had 1 target, 1 catch this past week. I would probably just sit either Jacksonville Jaguars tight end. I'm definitely not starting our guy Johnny Munt if he is a starting tight end, just not enough there. Brenton Strange, even if he plays this week, I don't know that I love him coming off the injury. He was seeing very solid volume in the previous 2 weeks, at least 7 targets, but yeah, it would feel a little bit shaky with him going into this matchup coming off the injury. I think that there's still better options potentially out there at the tight end position. Next up, we will have the Chargers traveling to face the Dolphins. Let's just go ahead and start with Justin Herbert and company. Okay, I do have concerns about Justin Herbert. these offensive line injuries are really hurting the Chargers, specifically in the passing game. If you guys watch any portion of the Chargers and Commanders matchup in Week 5, it was on full display. Rashawn Slater being lost for the season was obviously huge, but then going into the season with this past week with no Joe Alt absolutely hurt them. And it was on full display. And then now we have Omarion Hampton on IR, going to miss at least 4 games. So they're going to be relying on Hassan Haskins and Kamani Vidal at the running back position. So I don't know exactly how effective the run game is going to be. Obviously, all the wide receivers are still here, so that's good. And I mean, although the tight end room's been a little bit banged up, I don't think it's impacted things too drastically. But with all that being said, this is the Miami Dolphins. This is a really bad defense. They're giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I'm leaving Herbert in the start category. But if it was like any other matchup, like they faced the Colts in Week 7, the Vikings in Week 8, I would have him more like closer to the streaming category. He's a low-end start for me. And you look over the past 3 weeks, he's had 15 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. And he's only had more than 18 fantasy points once this year. So I'm a little worried, to say the least, about Justin Herbert. He's also thrown at least 1 interception in 3 straight games. But it's a good matchup, and there's still enough pass catchers on this team that if they have to rely on throwing the football, I think they can get it done between Keenan Allen, Quinn Johnson, and Ladd McConkey. So Herbert remains a start, but move with caution. Whoever the tight end is going to be this week, Orion Gadsden, Will Dissly, who's banged up, missed last week as well, Tyler Conklin, I just don't care. None of these guys are going to be fantasy relevant. Gadsden, I still think is worth paying attention to, but nobody that we can, rely on this week. All right, moving to the Dolphins. I've got Tua time in the streaming category, maybe a little bit of a lower end stream, but the Chargers have moved back a little bit in their ranking against quarterbacks, but they're still top 12 against a position in fantasy points allowed. But yeah, Tua coming off of a solid week against the Panthers. You were also top 12 against a position. So 22 fantasy points, 27 to 36, 256 passing yards, and 3 tutties. He's had 2 passing touchdowns in every game since week 2. So kind of remains in the streaming category, but you just don't know what you're going to get. 19, 20-ish fantasy points or 13 to 15 fantasy points. That's what we've gotten over the last 4 weeks. So move with caution, but he's okay in the streaming category. Then I'm leaving Darren Waller in the streaming category. The volume was a bit better this past week. 5 targets, 5 catches compared to 4 targets, 3 catches the previous week. But it's just like it's still kind of low volume here. I don't mind if you guys just are going to roll with Darren Waller while this is a thing and happening, and maybe that is all a season. That's fine. But the Chargers have been top 5 against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. So that concerns me just a little bit. But I still think Waller perfectly fine, good streaming option. He does have 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. If this was a looser matchup, I go ahead and say just roll with them, start him, don't worry about it. But because of the matchup, I'll put him in the streaming category here in week 6. All right, next up we have the Rams, who will travel to face the Ravens. Let's start with Matthew's staph infection and the Rams. This offense, this passing offense, and even the run game to a degree, they are humming. Matthew Stafford's been great the last 2 weeks. He's the QB 6 overall in fantasy right now with 27 fantasy points in week 4, 25 in week 5, 2 games in a row with over 370 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns. He sits around 60% roster. Talked about him in the waiver video. If he's out there floating, go pick up Matthew Stafford, especially even if you just want to play him this week alone. I think he's going to have a great week. The Ravens are giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks so far on the season, so I love this spot for Stafford. He, in my mind, is a must start here in week 6 of the season. Whoever the tight end is, Tyler Higbee shouldn't even maybe be on the screen. He was out this past week, so we saw Terrence Ferguson gets some work, as in 1 target, 1 catch, and Davis Allen 2 targets, 2 catches. But whoever the tight end is for the Rams, we're not even considering. They're not fantasy relevant. Okay, at the time of recording this, we don't know if Lamar Jackson's going to play this week. I don't really get the sense that we're going to know till a little bit later in the week, but the Ravens have a week 7 bye week, so there is theoretically the chance that they just let him rest through the bye week, including here in week 6. There's also the chance, with the way that this season has started, that they push for Lamar Jackson to play in this week 6 matchup and then rest through week 7 because, let's face it, this team is in need of some wins. But if Lamar Jackson plays, I just have a tough time benching him. I think you got to roll with him. If he's cleared, he's good to go. It's not the best matchup here, but I think you got to roll with him. If it's Cooper Rush, no thank you. He was god-awful last week, and I don't like his chances against this Rams front seven, so not even considering him in any format. Mark Andrews, I will have as a start, but you guys see the asterisk. I'm only starting Mark Andrews if Lamar Jackson does not, or excuse me, if Lamar Jackson does play this week. If he doesn't play, then I'm not rolling with Mark Andrews this week. Isaiah Likely, just been a sit. He's had one catch all year long since returning from, his injury and everything. So Andrews, play if Lamar's out there. If Lamar's not out there, don't play Andrews. And you can roll with Lamar if he is out there and active as well. Moving along, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Colts. Let's start with the Cardinals side of things. Kyler Murray is dealing with a foot injury. There is an off chance that he does not play here in week 6 of the season, but I think even if he does play, I don't love this matchup on the road against the Colts. It's been a good defense all year long. They are ranking top 6 against the quarterback position in terms of fantasy points allowed him. Kyler is yet to score more than 18 fantasy points in a game this year. 2 games with 18 fantasy points. Every other game, 15.3 or less. So I'm not feeling super bullish on Kyler right now. The offense looks pretty anemic outside of, the run game was fine last week against Tennessee, even with no James Conner. But Marvin Harrison still doing stuff. Trey McBride still doing stuff. But this offense is just not exciting. So not a great matchup. Kyler's just a streaming option, and with him dealing with the injury, he's a low-end streaming option. Quite frankly, this Colts defense is nothing to sneeze at. Trey McBride, no matter what, you start him. Even if we get a backup quarterback in here, which would be Jacoby Brissett, presumably, I still think Trey McBride is startable, just maybe to a lower degree there if we get a backup. Danny Dimes has been really just a streaming option the past 3 weeks. He's had 16 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games, and the Cardinals have actually been really good against opposing quarterbacks, top 5, just one spot below the Colts in terms of fantasy points allowed on the season. So Danny Dimes, you can stream, but we were kind of missing that ceiling that we were getting early in the season, and part of that is he's not really running in a lot of touchdowns. That was helping his fantasy value early in the season. Jonathan Taylor is running for an immense amount of touchdowns, which is hurting Daniel Jones, but if you got nothing better, you're desperate. He's still streamable. He's still a top 10 quarterback on the season so far. Tyler Warren has been absolutely lights out. You keep rolling with Tyler Warren if you own him. He's had 14 or more fantasy points, 2 straight games, 11 or more fantasy points, and 4 out of 5 games on the year. And finally found the end zone this past week, which was nice to see. So Tyler Warren, Trey McBride, you got no worries about these guys. The quarterbacks in this matchup, just streaming options in week 6. Moving along, we have the Cowboys traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Cowboys side of things. Dak Prescott has been lights out the last 2 weeks, 28 or more fantasy points, has thrown for 7 passing touchdowns in that same stretch. It's a tough matchup, believe it or not. The Panthers, top 10 against opposing quarterbacks, but even on the road here, you got to feel good about Dak Prescott. He's a strong start this week. Even with no CeeDee Lamb, maybe Prescott has looked perfectly fine, getting it done one way or another with the options that are out there. So go ahead, roll with Dak Prescott with confidence. A very strong start. And Jake Ferguson, an even stronger start. The Panthers are very bad against tight ends, giving up the second most fantasy points to the position. Ferguson's had 16 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games with a ceiling of 23 fantasy points. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. There's no questions asked here. He's a tight end 1 in PPR. Tight end 2 and half PPR, must start player at tight end this week. And I feel so good about Jake Ferguson this week that I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Jake Ferguson to score a touchdown here in week 6 of the season. Smash matchup against the Carolina Panthers. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. You gotta love this line on Underdog. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards week 6 of the season. Take that free Pick'em, take Ferguson to score a touchdown, and both of those lines hit. You will automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog has a brand new exclusive offer to anyone who signs up using promo code THECATCH. Once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to automatically receive $50 in bonus cash. And on top of that, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog. That link is down below if you guys want to take advantage of all of their Week 6 exclusive NFL offers. And we look to the Panthers. It's a great matchup. We know that. This is a really bad Dallas Cowboys defense. They're giving up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They haven't been very good against other positions as well. But, man, you can't feel good about Bryce Young. He's had 13 or less fantasy points in every game except for week 2 this year. So not a big discussion to be had here, even in Superflex, double QB leagues, Dynasty, deep leagues. Like, yeah, I'm not rolling or risking Bryce Young. Ja'Tavion Sanders missed this past week. Don't know if he's going to play this week. So Tommy Tremble filled in. He did nothing. 2 targets, 1 catch after having 15 fantasy points the week before. So once again, okay matchup here, but we're not considering any Panthers quarterbacks or tight ends here in week 6. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Saints. So let's start with Drake May and company. Drake May just 12 fantasy points in week 5. Didn't throw any touchdowns and run for any touchdowns, but he was still really good throwing the football, especially if you watch that game. He made some big time throws. And that victory on Sunday night over the Bills was 22 of 30, 273 passing yards, had 20 or more fantasy points in the 3 previous games. So I'm going to leave Drake May in the start category, also because he's playing the Saints, who are a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I think this is a good spot for Drake May. He's kind of like close to the streaming area, but at the same time, it's hard to put him there. Like, and the reason I say that is because we get some of these lower ceiling games, but we still get enough good games. He's just kind of in this weird area, but he's still a QB7 on the year. So I think I'm just going to leave him in the start category, and I'd feel pretty good if you got to roll with him this week. Hunter Henry, he's always like, once again, in a murky area. Like, is he a streamer? Is he a starter? If he doesn't score a touchdown, what exactly are we getting here? But it's a good matchup. The Saints have been really bad against tight ends. So Hunter Henry, still top 5 in half and full PPR scoring at tight end this year. So I would say just go ahead and roll with them. Then Spencer Rattler, you just can't trust. Outside of that week 2 performance against the Niners, we're looking at 16 or less fantasy points in every game. So you guys already know this. You're not rolling with Spencer Rattler, even in like desperation mode and super flex. It's just not a good option for you guys. Juwan Johnson hasn't quite been a good option the last 2 weeks after starting the season as one of the best tight ends in fantasy football. He's had 5.8 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. But the Patriots, although their defense has been playing better, they are bottom 5 against opposing tight ends on the year so far. So I still like this spot for Juwan Johnson. I think that this could be a get-right game. Then he gets the Bears the following week. Also a good matchup there. So I think he remains in the start category, but if it wasn't a good matchup, he'd probably be getting bumped down to the streaming area. So maybe move with some caution. But I think if he got to roll with Juwan Johnson this week, I think he's perfectly fine due to the matchup here in week 6. Moving along, we have the Browns traveling to face the Steelers. Let's start with Dillon Gabriel and the Browns side of things. I'm going to put Dillon Gabriel as a sit. Just 16 fantasy points in week 5. To his credit, looked fine against the Vikings. No turnovers, no interceptions, no fumbles. 19 of 33, 190 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I mean, wasn't lights out, but still for a rookie's first start and kind of a weird environment overseas against a Vikings defense that at times this year has been very opportunistic. Gabriel is fine, but I just don't, unless you're like just super, super desperate in a super flex league, I wouldn't even consider in any way, shape, or form Dillon Gabriel. And I don't love this matchup for him against the Steelers. Now, the Steelers have been bad against opposing quarterbacks this year. They have. Their defense has not been great this year. They're bottom 5 against opposing quarterbacks, but I just have a bad feeling. Browns on the road, divisional game, going to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh coming off a bye week. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking this one, but once again, I don't think you guys need to start Dillon Gabriel. It's not like we have robust quarterbacks on bye week this week. It's CJ Stroud and Carson Wentz. So I know there's been a lot of injuries, shakeups and stuff, but I'm just going to leave Gabriel as a sit, but let's give him some kudos for this past week's performance. Now, the frustrating thing is Harold Fannin, David Njoku are kind of back on the streaming radar after kind of just being too frustrating to even consider. They both had a touchdown this past week and double-digit fantasy points with Gabriel at quarterback. So does that roll over into week 6? That's tough to tell. This is, once again, a Steelers defense that's given up a good amount of fantasy points to the tight end position, bottom 10 against the position. So I think that Njoku and Fannin are startable, streamable. But let's face it, you're kind of playing with fire here. You never know what you're going to get out of these Browns tight ends on a week-to-week basis, so just move with caution. Then we look to the Steelers side of things, Aaron Rodgers and company here. Rodgers, you're looking at 12.8 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. Like, not particularly playing awful. It had a little interception bug weeks 2 and 3, but really not playing from a stance that makes us confident in fantasy at all. Then this Browns defense is definitely not a defense that we are excited to start quarterbacks against. So Rodgers is going to be a sit for me. And yeah, this tight end room is even more frustrating than the Browns tight end room because ultimately we're just not even getting the production between Johnny Smith and Pat Freiermuth. We look to week 4, they combined for 2 catches. We looked at the week before that, they combined for 4 catches. So these guys are sits. Let's move right along. All right, moving into the afternoon window on Sunday, we will have the Titans traveling to face the Raiders. Let's start with Cam Ward, who arguably had his best game of the season, 21-39 in week 5, and that victory over the Cardinals, 265 passing yards, but still an interception and just 9 fantasy points. And ultimately, if you watched most of that game, this offense didn't look any different than it looked the previous 4 weeks. So they got the victory, which was good. But yeah, you can't feel good about Cam Ward, regardless of the matchup. And the Raiders haven't been great against quarterbacks, but yeah, there's no way I'm recommending starting Cam Ward in any setting. Chicken Conquo, it's just been a sit for me all year long. Like, there are times where Chicken Conquo does things, but ultimately I don't feel good about him even as a streaming option. All right, Geno Smith getting bumped down to the sit category. We're still viewing him as a potential streamer at times. Had 2 good games in the first 3 weeks of the season, but it has been awful the last 2 weeks and 5 interceptions in the last 2 weeks. This week he gets the Tennessee Titans. You could be looking at a worse matchup, but it's also not a good matchup at the same time. That front 7 still been opportunistic at times. Even if they struggle against the run, they're okay at getting pressure on the quarterback. But long story short here, come on, Geno Smith has just been really bad. He's way too risky. We don't need to start him this week. Brock Bowers missed week 5. He's considered week to week. We don't know what's really going on with the knee injury. It's been kind of murky. If Bowers plays, I think you can still start Bowers. I think it's really tough to bench him. The Titans are still top 10 against opposing tight ends, so it's not the best matchup here. And I know Bowers has been really frustrating ever since week 1 where he looked like true to form. He's only had 9.8 or less fantasy points in every game and missed week 5 since. So Bowers, I'm leaving as a start for now, but we're getting close to having a very serious conversation about Brock Bowers, but I still want to believe that it's going to get better. Michael Mayer actually missed week 5 with a concussion, so you would have assumed he was the next man up, but it was actually Ian Thomas. And then we have Carter Runyon, a rookie, kind of floating around in case we see some more, long-term injury here to Bowers or Mayer. But ultimately, we don't need to consider any of these guys. Bowers, really the only player in any capacity I would consider here in week 6 of the season in this matchup. All right, next up we have the Niners traveling to face the Buccaneers. So let's start with the Niners. Brock Purdy's probably out this week in the off chance that he plays. I think he's fine to start. I mean, I know it's been really frustrating if you own Brock Purdy, but he's had 18 or more fantasy points in the 2 games that he has played in on the season, and the Bucs are a bottom 5 unit against opposing quarterbacks. So Purdy, if he plays, still startable, but we just don't know what's going to go on here. The Bucs tend to get in these kind of shootouts and allow quarterbacks to play to their strengths. So even coming off the injury, if he's starting, I think he's fine. But if it is Mac Jones, for all those same reasons, I think Mac Jones is plenty streamable. He wasn't great in week 3, but outside of that, he's had 21 or more fantasy points in all the games that he has started, and he looked pretty dang good against the Rams on the road on Thursday Night Football. So Mac Jones in the streaming category. We know there's going to be no George Kittle this week, so Jake Tongs, I mean, he's been really good the last 2 weeks. 14 or more fantasy points, 2 straight games, 2 touchdowns in 2 straight games, 3 touchdowns on the season so far. I think if you need a desperation streamer at tight end, he sits at 8% rostered. I think you can roll with Jake Tongs this week. Once again, the Bucs kind of allow teams to get in these shootouts. They're bottom 12 against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. Desperation start, but I think looking at everything, I have to recommend him as at least a streaming option. All right, Baker, Moneymaker, Mayfield remains in the start category for me every single week. 17 or more fantasy points every game this year. He's the QB3 in fantasy. He's going to go out there. He's going to sling it. Doesn't matter who is on the field. In terms of the offense, it doesn't matter what offensive linemen are healthy, what running backs, what wide receivers. Baker's going to sling it. He's going to find a way to get it done. Productive on a weekly basis from a fantasy perspective. You can keep rolling with them. Cade Otton showed up in week 5 like he does at times, but ultimately still really difficult to trust on a week-to-week basis. I don't particularly love him this week, and even if we continue to see some injuries here, whether it's Bucky Irving or Mike Evans, whoever, I just don't think that Cade Otton is a player at the tight end position, even if you're desperate, that we can fully trust here in week 6. All right, next up we have the Bengals traveling to face the Packers, and what is likely to be pretty one-sided affair. Let's start with the Bengals. There's an off chance that Jake Browning is replaced at the quarterback position. They have Brett Rypien signed to this active roster. They may go out and look for another quarterback, whether it's Russell Wilson or Jameis Winston or Phillip Rivers comes out of retirement. I don't know, but whoever it is, I'm not going to recommend starting them on the road against the Packers, and I'm certainly not going to recommend Jake Browning in any capacity. The Packers have been kind of middle of the road against quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed, but yeah, come on. We got 3 interceptions this past week for Browning. Whoever it's going to be, just no thank you. Whoever it is at tight end, Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant, way too difficult to trust on a week-to-week basis, so not going to be considering any tight ends for the Bengals as well. Jordan Love, I'm going to leave in the start category. Had 26 fantasy points in week 4, was on bye week this past week, but you got to feel pretty good against the Bengals, a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks. He's at home. I could see a game script here where there's a lot of Josh Jacobs, the Packers, the defense, the run game, they get up early. I could see all that happening. So maybe a lower ceiling for J-Lo, but you got to look at the matchup and take the matchup this week when it comes to Jordan Love. And quite frankly, you got to do the same thing with Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft's going to be one of my favorite, if not my very favorite player at the tight end position this week, as the Bengals have given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. You got to feel good if you own Tucker Kraft. He had double digits in week 4 before the week 5 bye week. This matchup way too good to ignore. Tucker Kraft, a must-start player at tight end here in week 6. All right, Sunday Night Football. It's going to be a good one. We got the Lions traveling to face the Chiefs. Let's start with Jared Goff and Sam Laporta. I still like Jared Goff this week. I'm going to leave him in the start category. The Chiefs haven't been particularly great against opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. Always tough to trust Goff, and he's on the road here, which, he's got that negative connotation around, but still had 20 fantasy points on the road last week, threw 3 touchdowns against the Bengals. And once again, the Chiefs haven't been great here. They're only a few spots below the Bengals in terms of fantasy points allowed against quarterbacks, but still, I think if you own Goff, solid start this week. I think you can roll with them. Top 12 quarterback in fantasy. I think he's perfectly fine. Sam Laporta showed up big time. Once again, talking about the Bengals being awful against tight ends. He had 20 fantasy points, a touchdown, 5 catches for 92 receiving yards this past weekend. It's not particularly a good matchup. The Chiefs are top 5 against opposing tight ends on the season, but I still think if you own Sam Laporta, he just kind of falls into this category of tight ends that if you own him, you just roll with the punches, you take what's there. And I think he's perfectly solid, maybe a little bit lower end of a start because there is some inconsistency there, but he's still fine to roll with this week. Patrick Mahomes, an absolute must-start quarterback. I've been really, talking up Mahomes for weeks now, it feels like, and I don't really understand why I've had to do that. If you own Mahomes, you are just rolling with him. He's the QB2 in fantasy. He's had 23 or more fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games on the year. And in week 3 against the Giants, like the game plan that was implemented, they did not need to throw the football against the Giants. So like that matchup doesn't even have me concerned, right? And he's coming off of 2 straight performances with 27 fantasy points. You got to feel good about Mahomes and what should be a high-scoring matchup. The Lions defense, I mean, nothing to sneeze at. Middle of the pack against quarterbacks, but you got to feel good here if you own Mahomes. Keep rolling with him. And yeah, my thesis on Travis Kelce all year long, similar to a guy like Sam Laporta. If you own Kelce, you just keep rolling with him. He's not going to score every week like he did this past week against Jacksonville. Had his best game of the season so far, 8 targets, 7 catches, 61 receiving yards. Touchdown, 19 fantasy points. Probably won't happen this week, but you still just roll with him. He is as solid of a tight end as you're going to get. Call him what you want, Mr. Taylor Swift, washed, old, whatever, overrated, but he's the tight end 6 in full PPR, tight end 7 in half PPR on the season so far. Still a solid start. Noah Gray, not even worth talking about. He's a sit here in week 6 of the season. Next up, we have the Bills, who will travel to face the Falcons to kick off one of the 2 Monday night matchups we'll be treated to here in week 6. Let's talk about Josh Allen, who had 20 fantasy points against the Patriots in week 5, 253 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, 53 yards on the ground. Do we really need to talk about Josh Allen? He's the QB1 so far on this season. Tough matchup, the Falcons, even with being on bye week last week, still ranked top 5 against opposing quarterbacks on the season so far, but and Josh Allen, you start him no matter what. Not a lot to break down here. Dalton Kincaid remains a start for me on a week-to-week basis. This is another player that I've really tried to engrave in your guys' brains. Like, there's certain players right now, Dalton Kincaid, Dallas Goedert, these players at the tight end position that just need to be starts on a week-to-week basis. And Dalton Kincaid, as good of a tight end that you're going to find. Tight end 2 in full PPR, tight end 1 in half PPR. Keep rolling with them. 16 fantasy points, 6 catches, 6 targets, 108 receiving yards in week 5. Gets the Falcons this week. They are technically allowing the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, but you still got to feel good here. Josh Allen, Dalton Kincaid. Ignore the matchup. You got to roll with these guys here in week 6 of the season. Michael Penix, I don't feel as strongly about, although he was solid in week 4, 19 fantasy points. Threw for over 300 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, did have a pick. Gets Buffalo this week. They're at home. I mean, it's definitely not the worst spot for Michael Penix, but I just am not ready to trust him at the quarterback position at this point in the season. So he's going to be a sit for me. Let's kind of evaluate the next couple weeks before we move him into any type of streaming area, as he had 5 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games before week 4. So Kyle Pitts scored his first touchdown of the season in week 4, had a really nice game, 18 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 catches, 70 receiving yards. So he remains in the streaming category for me. This Bills defense has been really up and down on the season so far, but they are just one spot behind the Falcons, in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight end. So it's a tough spot, tough matchup for Kyle Pitts, but he is streamable if you don't have better options here in week 6. All right, and to wrap things up, the second Monday Night Football game this week will be the Bears, who will travel to face the Commanders. The Bears on bye week in week 5, and Caleb Williams didn't particularly have a good day in week 4 on the road against the Raiders. An interception in that game, 2 fumbles, and was 22 of 37, 212 passing yards, threw a touchdown. So I'm going to leave him as a start this week, though, because the Commanders have been bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks, and Caleb has been solid outside of week 4 on the season so far. It's a weird matchup against the Raiders, right? So I think Caleb's still startable. I wouldn't be too overreactive here. Coming out of the bye week, I think Ben Johnson will have this offense ready on the road here, so I'll still roll with Caleb Johnson as a start. Tight end, like Colston Loveland's been banged up. Don't know if he's going to play this week. So you see mainly Cole Kmet, who did have 9 targets in week 4, is maybe in the streaming area if Loveland doesn't play. But once again, I just don't trust it. He's had 10 targets in the 2 games in his last 2 games and just 4 catches. So not really feeling super bullish there. Then we look to the Commanders. Jayden Daniels, solid in his return from injury. 17 fantasy points, 15 of 26, 231 passing yards, a passing touchdown. Was still able to run the football, had 39 rushing yards as well. So you got to like this spot against the Chicago Bears. They've been really bad against opposing quarterbacks all year long. So Jayden Daniels, let's not be overreactive to the fact that he missed 2 games. He's still a very solid, very good start in a very, very good matchup here in week 6. Zach Ertz gets bumped down to the streaming area. Can't call him anything more than that. Not the worst matchup here against the Bears. Have been pretty bad against tight ends this year, but he's at 6.8 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games, and a goose egg this last week. 0 fantasy points, after starting the season off with double digits in the first 2 games and a touchdown in the first 2 games. So going to leave him as a streamer, and I can't call him anything more than that, but he does have a good matchup this week. So if you need to roll with Zach Ertz out of desperation, I still think it's fine. If it was a tougher matchup, I'd be a little bit more worried, but I think between week 6 and 7, having the Bears and the Cowboys, we can see Zach Ertz come back and get back to what we were seeing earlier in the season. And there you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single quarterback, every single tight end, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 6 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So make sure you guys ask all your questions down there. Whatever you guys need as the week progresses, I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can. And while you're down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that like button and that subscribe button on the way out. It really helps out the channel tremendously. And when all the videos, playlists, all that good stuff pops up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 6 fantasy content, because we'll have everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate this week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.